Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our program on the topic of when alcohol use becomes abuse. Today's program is co-hosted by the Healthy Relationships Initiative and Fellowship Hall. My name is Christine Murray, and I oversee the Healthy Relationships Initiative, as well as I'm the director of the Center for Youth, Family, and Community Partnerships at UNC Greensboro. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm going to share a few kind of housekeeping details. We welcome your questions and comments. We've got this program streaming through two different locations, actually. We've got some people who are joining us through our Zoom room, and we welcome questions in the chat room there. And we'll be saving our questions and saving some time for that toward the end of the program, as well as some of you might be joining us today on Facebook Live, and we've got someone who's also going to be monitoring those questions as well, and we'll be sharing those too back with us. So depending on time, we may not be able to answer all of the questions, but we will certainly do our best to answer the questions that you have, and we also just welcome a lot of interaction in the chat room space throughout the program today. So again, I want to thank all of you who are joining us as participants in today's program, and I want to give a special welcome and thanks to our panelists. We are very grateful for your time, for volunteering your time, and your insights that you'll be sharing with us today. So I'm going to start by introducing all of our panelists, and I'll just go in the order in which they're listed on your screen, and then we'll be hearing from each of them as we go throughout the program today. So our first panelist is Kendriya Harris, and she is a family counselor at Fellowship Hall, and she has experience working with teens and families to prevent and treat substance abuse. Our next panelist is Bernhard, and he's a men's primary counselor at Fellowship Hall, and he also has a master's in clinical mental health counseling and couple and family counseling from UNC Greensboro. Next up is Nataki Watson, and she's a counselor also in the men's primary program at Fellowship Hall. Before she joined Fellowship Hall, she was an assessment counselor and inpatient case manager in the behavioral health field. And then our final panelist today is Mike Wildman, and Mike is a licensed clinical addiction specialist and a certified clinical supervisor, and he has over 15 years experience in drug and alcohol treatment. So as you can tell, we've got a great panel lined up for you today. Before we jump into the discussion, I just wanted to share a brief overview. Again, as I mentioned, we'll be going through some discussion with each of our panelists who each have prepared some thoughts about some specific topics related to this. But I did want to mention that one of the reasons why we decided to do this program was that we have seen a lot of news reports about how alcohol consumption has been increased during the coronavirus pandemic, as well as people have been making a lot of jokes and comments about how alcohol use is something that's sort of becoming more normalized on social media. So we also know that people sometimes can really have struggles in this area. And so we wanted to come together. Today's program is really sort of intended for the general population to help understand if you have concerns about your own alcohol consumption or the alcohol consumption of someone in your life that you love and care for. So that's really our focus for today. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. And I've got a question for you, Mike. So Mike, you see people you work in a private practice setting. So what do you see as some of the common relationship challenges that you're seeing people come in to your private practice with currently during this pandemic?
Great. Thanks, Christine, for the opportunity to be here. Right. So yeah, folks are coming in the door right now. A lot of couples are stuck at home, sheltering in place, and just dealing with all of the stress of sheltering in place and all of the financial worries and concerns about the economy and jobs and missing important social connections by being at home. And alcohol is something that's definitely a part of a lot of people, when anxiety gets too big and when worry gets too big. And at home with couples, when alcohol starts to sort of move from enjoyment into that sort of problem area, that ends up coming up with, a lot of kind of arguments, emotions get big, and kind of arguments and anger erupts, or a lot of times folks are just because of their alcohol use just aren't able to function and to contribute to home or work or family life, maybe is where they had before, when alcohol wasn't as big a part of things.
So of course, spending a lot of time together can be something that can be a real blessing for people in their relationships and having more time together. But having so much time together can certainly be increasing a lot of stress on top of other health stressors or economic stressors that people might be facing. So let's talk specifically about some of the challenges that you might be seeing people have when it comes to substances right now. Are you seeing some specific issues related to alcohol use and abuse? And if so, could you share a little bit about those with us?
Oh, right, definitely. So a lot of folks are, talking about trying to deal with that extra stress that the pandemic has brought on, and so many unknowns, and just not knowing what's going to happen. And people are really unable to connect with sort of normal healthly outlets to deal with stress. The gyms are closed, the movie theaters closed. People aren't gathering in a organized faith community in person. So lots of those things. And people have lost, sort of normal structure of their life. Instead of going to an office 8 to 5 or whatever every day, they're at home. So some of those things that have sort of normally limited alcohol use aren't even there. So people might find themselves, drinking, while they're working from home. Since people are stuck at home, people who have been going out to drink on restaurants and bars, that which was sort of out of sight, now when people are home is sort of in sight. You can't sort of hide that sort of behavior from partners and things like that. So it's just, again, leading into, arguments and disagreements and kind of further problems.
So it sounds like you're saying sometimes people's use of alcohol could be something that might trigger fights among people in relationships or within families or couples. Is that how does that sometimes look, or how does that impact couples or relationships?
Well, so we know one of those important parts of alcohol, one of those things that people find some enjoyment of, is that loss of inhibitions. And people are wanting to feel better, and alcohol sort of initially does that, but then it's a central nervous system depressant. It definitely changes our emotions. It changes how we handle our emotions. It changes how we're feeling, and all of those often erupt in arguments or in anger, or people not being able to contribute to their family because of intoxication. They're unable to take care of what they need to take care of around the house and responsibilities.
Thanks, Mike. Those are some really great points. And I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Kendriya now. And Kendriya, of course, as Mike was mentioning, there are, people are home more. They might be home drinking alone, or drinking, in the context of within their family, or just with their relationship partner. So could you help us to understand what is the difference between problem drinking and casual drinking? And how can someone know if their own drinking or the drinking of a loved one is a problem?
Thank you so much, Christine, for asking that question. And I'll probably piggyback a little bit off of some of the things that Mike said. Just for discussion purposes, if we can look at 3 different kinds of what you would consider drinking. Casual versus social drinking can sometimes be looked at as an occasional drink where someone's drinking responsibly. Problem drinking in some ways can be looked at as frequent alcohol use, drinking more than you meant to drink, and maybe sometimes doing things that you might regret later. But then thinking about when it rolls over into alcoholism, the drinking can't be controlled, negative consequences, and usually even after negative consequences, those behaviors or the drinking still continues. So just for discussion purposes, casual versus social, casual drinking, problem drinking, and then alcoholism. Some of the signs, and I think that people before maybe even think that drinking alone is one of the criteria for that indicate problem drinking or alcoholism in some way, or that there is an issue. It's not necessarily one of the criteria. And especially now that, in the midst of the pandemic, people probably are spending a little more time alone and maybe drinking alone. So it may be a little bit more important to attune yourselves to some of the signs. I think Mike might have mentioned some of these behavior changes, drinking while at work, even though you're working from home, drinking while at work, sometimes even drinking just trying to function. Also, as well, being real cognizant of how your thoughts are a part of this. When we think about obsessive thoughts that contribute to the drinking, that may sometimes lead to the compulsion to drink. Always thinking about drinking or the next drink can be a sign for yourself, maybe. Also, with too much time recovering from having drank, spending too much time consuming, as well as some other things like sneaking, trying to, to drink, or hiding it from family members or from people that may have something to say or may be concerned. And then, one that really carries a lot of weight is just trying to stop but can't. In some situations, people, are trying to moderate it. Well, that didn't work. Just going to cut back and only drink at this time. That could be a sign or a tip that there may be something going on.
So it sounds like there's a lot of possible signs. And I think one of the things that can be really complicated if you're trying to consider whether yourself or someone that you love or care for might be experiencing problem drinking is, it doesn't sound like there's like a real clear-cut line as to the difference between those different categories about casual drinking, social drinking, and problematic drinkings. So do you have any thoughts, like if somebody was concerned about a loved one especially, and just sort of starting to feel like, man, I'm realizing there's some of these signs that I'm seeing in my loved one, but how do I know for sure? And I think maybe to add to the mix of that oftentimes people who are experiencing problem drinking are not going to say that. They don't necessarily, they're not the first ones necessarily who are going to come and admit that. So what recommendation do you have if somebody's really struggling with that?
That's a really good question. And you do make a valid point when you say that it's hard to sometimes to distinguish, specifically if we're looking at ourselves and our own drinking. But I think sometimes other people, when they notice our behaviors, or sometimes look different than what it may have looked like before. And I would suggest for family members and friends and people who care about someone who might be drinking is to get educated. Really the first thing might not be going to the person and saying, hey, do you have a drinking problem? Or I see, this is happening. Maybe educate yourselves. And it seems like you guys are doing that already just by being on this webinar. But yeah, just education, I think, really gives a little bit more insight than you may not have had prior to. And I think sometimes with the stigmas that are attached to alcoholism as a disease, people sometimes shy away from it and may not have that knowledge on reserve until it hits your family. And then sometimes it's a little bit late after that, and not late to the fact that you can't go and learn, but now we probably have fallen into some of the behaviors that have may have been maladaptive up to a specific point. So I would suggest and recommend just learning about alcoholism as a disease so that you can have some of the ideas, maybe surrounding yourselves with people who have a little more information or knowledge about it, Al-Anon meetings and stuff like that. And then, of course, if you need to have the conversation with your loved one, saying frankly what you've noticed with regards to a change in the behavior. Not really accusatory, but more so solid things that you can say, hey, this happened, or when you were drinking, you did this, and when you this or that. It really can carry a little more weight than to speculate. But what I would say ultimately, without so many words, is really just get some education and support around the disease of addiction, alcoholism, and then also maybe approach your loved one with regards to, talk to them real frankly and honestly about what you know, what you've learned, but then also that you're concerned about the changes that you see in their behavior.
Those are really great points. And I think especially just to kind of re-emphasize the importance of, if you have concerns about a loved one's use of alcohol, or really any substances, that you don't have to go through that by yourself, but to reach out for help, whether that's help by getting more information so you can empower yourself with that knowledge, or get help by seeking support from a professional or a loved one maybe who has some experience who can help offer some wisdom. So those are great points, Kendra. We'll come back to you a little bit later in the program, but I want to shift over to talking with Bernhard for a minute. And I think one of the topics, or one of the reasons why this question right now of, you know, how is it moving from sort of use of substances to problematic use or abuse or whatever language you might prefer, is because, you know, to some ways right now, social media is really normalizing relatively heavy use of drinking. I know that I've seen several memes and, you know, posts on social media that just sort of kind of seem to make light of the fact that people are just drinking a lot right now. And so that could normalize it and make it even more difficult for people potentially to recognize that. So what are your thoughts, especially as one who works in this field, Bernhard, about the role that you think social media plays regarding how alcohol abuse is viewed, especially during this unique situation of the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Murray, for having me here again. And yeah, it's a great question. I think when we're considering like people who are already at risk for, you know, substance use disorder, alcoholism, addiction, and you add on top of it the isolation from, you know, COVID-19 and self-quarantining. Yeah, there's, you know, these people are at a higher risk now to advancing in the severity, I guess, of their substance use, alcohol use, whatever it may be. And so, yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, the meme culture has absolutely exploded with all sorts of stuff about the quarantine and drinking and increased drinking during this time. And yeah, I mean, I just wanted to share some of the hashtags that were trending. You know, quarantine drinks, quarantine cocktails, quarantine drinking games, quarantine drinking queen, don't quarantine sober, quarantine drink of the day, sip in quarantine, quarantine beer blog. So, you know, there's just several accounts that are really promoting and glorifying kind of the use of alcohol. And, you know, I do want to clarify, like, when I'm kind of giving this information, I'm really talking about people who are at risk, right, for substance use or alcohol use disorder. These things in and of themselves aren't necessarily problematic, but just considering, you know, okay, if I'm already at high risk and then social media is giving me these messages that, you know, alcohol and other substances are things that I could use to sort of self-medicate, and then the quarantine on top of that, you know, and memes and the stuff that's coming out now is saying even to a further extent. And yeah, I mean, so it's absolutely normalized drinking more heavily, especially during this
And so what about in terms of how it might then impact whether people are willing to get help, or even their thoughts about if help is even available? I think, you know, that's another concern too, is that a lot of people think, well, you know, I'm stuck at home right now, all the businesses are closed, it's likely that these helping resources might be closed as well. So how do you think social media might play into that piece too?
Yeah, and this is something that I think is really important to talk about. Just, I guess, the difference between sort of internal and external consequences. And, you know, social media sort of has this narrative of who and what an addict or an alcoholic may look like, and what the consequences should sort of look like for somebody who's, you know, going to be seeking help. And so, especially during this time where there's maybe increased substance use, increased alcohol use, being able to start to look at, okay, what are some of the more internal consequences that individuals are experiencing, and really honoring them instead of maybe trying to compare to what media is projecting as, you know, bad enough. When is it bad enough for me to seek help, you know, and not having to wait until that point. I mean, you know, unfortunately, yeah, a lot of the resources that, you know, are typically available are mostly limited to Zoom right now. And, you know, I think it's amazing what's happened with that. It's definitely, you know, unexpected that the recovery communities have come together to kind of support each other in this way through Zoom. But yeah, as far as being in person, I mean, there's really not a whole lot right now.
And so that might be one way too that people could potentially connect through social media to supportive communities as well, right? So maybe there are recovery communities that people could connect to through social media potentially, so that social media might actually have some positive benefits. Do you have any thoughts on that piece?
Yeah, definitely. There's tons of NA and AA groups through Facebook, Instagram, just kind of looking up your area, whatever area you may be in, and then followed by Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, and even beyond that, things like Refuge Recovery, and some other I guess like recovery related or abstinence related support groups.
Those are some great resources. And we'll talk more about some other resources, but I thought I'd mention it now too. And I think before we move on to a different topic, which is about coping, which actually I think if you are finding yourself really struggling with looking at some of the messaging about coping, for people to, on a practical level, remember that one thing that you can do is unfollow if you see people who are, sharing posts or information that might be triggering or stressful for you, and also following resources and pages and platforms that are empowering and encouraging for you. So thanks, Bernhard. I'm going to turn over to Nataki right now. And so, as I mentioned, I wanted to shift to talking a little bit about coping. And of course, we know that this pandemic is very stressful for people. I think everybody's stress is different, depending on how this situation is impacting them and their family. And so, of course, substances, alcohol are things that sometimes people do use as a coping mechanism. And so, Nataki, can you talk with us a little bit about coping mechanisms and how people can find healthy coping mechanisms that work for them? And you are still muted. There we go.
Okay. Thanks, Christine, so much for bringing us together to talk about this really important and timely issue. I first wanted to piggyback off something that you just mentioned in reference to the messages that we get on social media around drinking or substance use or whatever the behavior is during quarantine. And when it comes to thinking about how to kind of cope with some of this and how to do something different, the first thing would be to turn off the social media, right? To disconnect. It's important to find ways to cope. Coping mechanisms are the way that we deal with stress or some type of emotional response, and the way that we manage our emotions so that we can get back to some sense of emotional well-being, or a baseline level of feeling more even. So it's important when you're in a situation where everything is out of the norm, to first kind of figure out if you notice that you're drinking or that someone that you love is drinking more, to kind of figure out, okay, well, why is that? That's the first thing you need to do, to figure out where that's coming from. Some of the big reasons that come up the most about why people will resort to some sort of substance to kind of relieve that tension or stress is boredom, loneliness, depression, anxiety. Those are kind of like the big things that come up that, we feel like we need to do something to try to ease that. And, alcohol or some sort of substance is a easy and quick way to kind of numb that out. But if you can kind of take a moment to kind of figure out where that's coming from, if I'm just drinking because I'm bored, I don't have anything else to do, I'm sitting around the house all day, and so this seems like a good way to kill time. Or if you are feeling a heightened level of anxiety, because to be honest, there's a lot going on in the world right now, and whether you're watching the news or social media or whatever, there's a lot, and so that can increase a lot of anxiety. Maybe you've lost someone, so there's grief and depression and all that goes along with that. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. So when it comes to coping, figuring out what's going on, what you're feeling, and then once you know what that is, then you can figure out what to do about it. So when I'm working with clients or guests, as we call them here, one of the First things that we do, boredom is usually the number one trigger for all of them. And then the question becomes, okay, well, when you're feeling bored, the best thing to do is to get up and do something. So that's the moment where you can begin to find hobbies that you didn't know that you liked, new ones or old ones, and to rediscover old things that you like to do, to get up and get out the house, to move. You know, distraction is a very handy tool, and it's very helpful when you're feeling bored. Also, because we are isolating more and socially distancing ourselves more, there's that loss of connection. So we begin to feel kind of lonely and disconnected from others. We are social creatures. So finding other ways to do that. And I will often sit with guests and we'll start to kind of brainstorm what are some of the ways that you can reconnect with people differently. That is one of the times where technology becomes a very helpful tool. So just like we're coming together and talking about this very important issue via Zoom, you can have Zoom meetings. You know, there's been Zoom graduations and parties and birthday celebrations and things like that. So using the technology to your benefit. Now that we do have the restrictions have been lifted, going and doing things outside, for example, having, you know, friend dates out in the park where you can be socially distanced, but you're still talking and you're communicating, because it is important to be able to do that. When it comes to other things, though, emotional things, whether you're dealing with grief, depression, anxiety, things like that, those are times where the coping mechanisms shift a little bit. And that is normally one of the first things that we will talk about is the importance of mindfulness and mindfulness meditation, and how that can really help with easing anxiety and helping you to kind of recenter yourself. Exercise is great for reducing anxiety, getting out, moving around. Certainly the weather's great, so we can do that. And it also helps you to be more social, to be around people, and will lift your mood. Um, and then, of course, spirituality. That's something maybe we don't really talk about a lot, but reconnecting in that way. So, of course, meditation is part of that, prayer, connecting with other people that you may share some sort of spiritual, you know, backgrounds or ideas with is also helpful.
I think those are all really great points. And I appreciate how you covered all of these different points on here so nicely. We did have a great question that came in on Facebook that is about how to know, you know, and I think it really connects to this discussion about coping mechanisms. That's why I want to really bring it in right now. And they asked, how can we sort of tell a difference between someone who really does have a problem versus someone who is just using alcohol to cope, for example. So I'm just trying to take the edge off of this stress. I'm just bored, so it's okay, you know, to have this drink or, you know, these drinks. So, you know, kind of that line, it sounds like, you know, from what you've said, I would speculate that part of it is, are there alternatives? You know, is that the only thing that they're doing to cope? Versus, you know, maybe do they have a range of coping strategies, you know, sort of in addition to some of those signs that we've already talked about. But what, you know, what would be some of your, do you have any additional thoughts that you might want to add about sort of that? Well, I'm just using this to cope. I'm just using this to, you know, manage a little stress at the end of a hard day.
My thought would be then that's the problem. Because there's so many other things that you can do other than numb it, because that's basically what you're doing with the substances, you're numbing it. And you don't want that to become your default go-to strategy. So what are some other ways that you can work through this? If you are feeling anxious, okay, well, instead of having a beer, what are some other things that you can do instead? Because, you know, if you're doing it this time to handle the stress and anxiety that you feel, then that's what you're more likely to continue to kind of resort back to that. And there's so many other ways, you know, to deal with that. And it kind of goes back, you know, with the pandemic, there's this broader issue that everybody's life and schedule has been completely disrupted, right? So, you know, there's something to be said about the routine that we have of getting up in the morning and getting dressed and driving to work and, you know, having the place at work where this is the place for work and the people that we talk to. So once that's all disrupted, then it creates, unease, right? And we have to figure out how to recreate a new structure for ourselves, so that we can have that, sense of calm and peace and knowing, because we have to create that for ourselves.
I think that's really helpful there. And I think that that is a really, kind of a good point about just even if that's something that you're constantly sort of turning to help you cope, then that can be a real sign, that it might become something that's more of a problem. So keep the questions coming for those of you who are here with us live today. Thank you, Nataki. I'm going to turn back to you, Mike. We've already touched on this a little bit, but could you share a little bit more about getting help? And let's talk specifically first about people who are possibly, first recognizing that they or someone that they care about might be experiencing alcohol abuse or dependence or problem drinking, whatever language we may want to use. And then let's talk also for people who are maybe already in recovery and maybe what additional resources they can draw upon. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, yeah, so I think definitely, getting connected to a professional is a great first step. I think you have to pay attention to what your loved ones are saying and what is going on with you, and have that courage to reach out to talk to a professional. So that would be, looking for a licensed therapist out there, somebody who has experience and training in working with substance use disorders. Guilford County is an area where there are lots of providers, and lots of providers are out there and willing to help. There's kind of that first initial barrier is maybe the cost part. So if you're uninsured, there are definitely lots of resources out there for you to get treatment. You can contact our local management entity, managed care organization, the Sandhills Center, and get connected with help through there. If you're lucky enough to have health insurance, flipping over the back of that insurance card and calling that 1-800 number for behavioral health services, or going online to see who's in network. And just like shopping for anything else out there, whether it's furniture or appliances or clothes, getting on the internet, getting in your favorite search engine, and wading through. There are a lot of providers out there, and a lot of folks are definitely providing services. Again, it's going to be through this telebehavioral health platform where you're looking at somebody through a screen. But I'm finding that people are very comfortable with that. That's a really easy transition. I'm meeting with people who have never been in therapy before, and they go, "Oh, this is what are we going to do? This is we're just going to talk." So we talk, and it's a pretty easy transition for a lot of folks, and a way to get help. So definitely meeting with somebody who's licensed, getting a thorough assessment of what's going on, and creating a plan for change, and seeing what change is going to look like for you.
I think that's a great point. And I think we're starting to see more providers are doing in-person, in-office visits, but really, I think many mental health professionals and substance abuse counselors have shifted to online telehealth options. So certainly help is available, and in many ways, it can be a very accessible way to reach services, because you don't have to worry about driving to the appointment, and things like that could be barriers for some people. So, and also for people who, whether they're sort of first in that point of wondering if they are having some problems or concerns, or for people in recovery, there are online groups for AA right now, online recovery groups right now. So could you speak a little bit more to that in terms of either those specific groups or other resources for people who are, sort of already accessing help?
Right. Yeah. So for folks who are in recovery, of course, this is a really stressful time, and everyone has sort of contributed all the ways that this is a really stressful time, and a time where everything that maybe has worked before is under stress, and all of that. So managing a substance use disorder or any other mental health condition, these are chronic disorders, just like people handle other chronic disorders like diabetes or hypertension or chronic heart problems. So, you know, it's using that, that treatment plan that they've been doing, managing their physical health, managing their emotional health, managing sleep, doing, you know, all of those, you know, getting connected to a spiritual tradition or a faith community, or maintaining contact with a 12-step support, or a 12-step sponsor. So, you know, it's continuing to do sort of whatever it is that got them to their place of recovery, and digging back in there. You know, anybody who's managing a chronic health condition, no matter if they're taking their medication and seeing their doctor and eating the right foods and doing all the right stuff, they still have flare-ups. You know, this is a part of dealing with this ongoing, and it's no different than that than people who are, you know, in recovery from alcohol or other drug disorders. So it's just continuing to use all of those resources that are out there, and whatever way they look differently now, whether it's on an online format. But you know, help is available, help is out there, and there are so many folks ready and willing to help better the mental and health of our community. So.
Those are really great points. And I think isolation is such a big factor during this pandemic. But for people to know that you may not be seeing those sources of support, but they are readily available, and reach out. You can just see the examples of the panelists that we have joining us today, that there are professionals who are, you know, still doing this work even during these really difficult times. So I'm going to shift our order just a little bit, and we'll come back to the closing points. We have one other question that I see in our Zoom group chat, and perhaps while our panelists are addressing that question, if anybody else who's joining us live has any questions that they would like to share in either the Facebook comments or our Zoom chat room, go ahead and do that now, because we'll be wrapping up our program shortly after we take this next question. But our next question from the Zoom chat room, and feel free, I guess, you know, just whichever one of our panelists wants to take this question, go for it. But we have a question: is alcoholism genetic? If one of your parents was an alcoholic, are you at bigger risk for becoming an alcoholic? And I think this is a really pertinent question for our discussion today, because that might be something that people might be wondering for themselves or someone that they love. So which of our panelists would like to jump in and start with that question? Or do I need to call? Oh, Kendriya, go for it.
I'll jump in and talk a little bit about that. While I won't try to profess that I am, you know, real as versed on the neurological and genetic, you know, components that have a part in it, I would say that, as you know, there's a combination of factors. You know, when we think about addiction, it's a biopsychosocial. We add the spiritual piece to that, and so I think that even as we talk about a predisposition, a genetic predisposition, meaning that maybe there are some factors or something that can contribute to someone, genetic factors that could contribute to someone becoming an alcoholic because of their parents, or but I also think, to add to that, it's important to understand all of the other components, like the social aspect of just kind of, sometimes we just mirror what we see. We imitate some of the behaviors that we see, and just growing up, we learn by mere observation. I think also too, spirituality can in some ways be passed down just based on what you're exposed to, as well as a psychological component when we think about a chemical imbalance, what other factors are playing a part inside someone's mind, or their, you know, their makeup with regards to how they cope with life. I think that, yes, as a risk factor kind of, you know, approach, maybe because of all those components can be contributed, or people have been exposed in some ways because of parents or caregivers or people around them engaging in alcohol behaviors and stuff like that. But I don't think that there's any way that we can say there's this one thing makes someone more or less likely to become someone that struggles with alcoholism. But I do think that it's important to understand what those risk factors are, similar to what I just talked about, the biological component, the psychological components, as well as the social and spiritual components. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it sounds like it's really about looking at that as one of many possible risk factors or indicators that somebody could potentially be more prone to developing alcoholism, and not one thing that certainly guarantees it or is a direct pathway toward it, but it's important to really look at that bigger picture.
Right.
So we've had another question that's come in through our Zoom chat room, and I want to address that because I think at a real practical level, one of the things we've talked about this to some extent, but I think to maybe get really practical, if you specifically have somebody in your life who you suspect is showing behaviors of problem drinking or an addiction, what can you say or do to really help them? And I will point before I turn this over, so you all panelists can be thinking about which one of you is going to volunteer for this one. But we actually, with Bernhard, through the Healthy Relationships Initiative, we recently actually did another online program on supporting a loved one facing addiction. And maybe I can ask Camilla if she could, our HRI program coordinator, if she could share the link for that before the program is over in our Zoom room, as well as in the Facebook chat. Because I think that could be a good resource for some more in-depth. But I think, the more practical we can kind of get about this, what do you say to that person? Or, how do you manage your own boundaries? And I know we could, and we have done a whole program on that very topic, but what would be a few really clear, maybe starting points? So who would like to jump in and start with that one? Bernhard, I'm actually just going to go ahead and call on you because you did a whole program on that. So why don't you share a few points on that that might help our participants here?
Yeah, for sure. So some things that immediately come to mind, and some of this has been mentioned a little bit, but absolutely, across the board, one of the best things anybody can do is educate themselves on what addiction is and what it means to be an addict or an alcoholic. Or meet, criteria for substance use disorder. What does that mean? In that way, you can begin to have an empathetic understanding and sort of approach with these people, rather than coming at them from a position of, why can't you stop using? Why are you choosing drugs or alcohol over our relationship? But instead, you have this more, I guess, this approach that Kendriya is kind of pointing at, which is, this disease affects all areas of life, and individuals are using against their will rather than making a conscious decision on a daily basis to put a substance or alcohol above those relationships, above work, above whatever. And so education is the first big thing, I would say. The next thing, Dr. Murray, you've kind of mentioned a little bit here with setting boundaries. And so to be more specific with that, I would say setting boundaries that you're willing to stick to, which can be very difficult. But we talk about it in the family program here, how if I can't follow through on a boundary, it's not a boundary, it's a threat. And so being able to keep boundaries in place that I really am willing to stick to, and those can be very, very difficult. Like if you decide that you want to drink and drive the car, you can no longer have access to my car, things of that nature. And so beginning to kind of have discussions around, what are appropriate boundaries, what's a realistic situation, depending on, I guess, what the relationship to that person looks like, if that's a spouse, if that's a child or a friend. Obviously, those are going to be different in each of those. But definitely establishing some boundaries, and then something that has also been touched on, seeking professional help for yourself, reminding yourself that you're not responsible for this person's addiction or alcoholism, and seeking help through things like Nar-Anon, things like Al-Anon, where you can kind of learn about behaviors related to codependency and enabling and learning more about yourself and what role you might play in that person's life and how you are enabling their addiction or maybe enabling their recovery and hopefully learning ways through those resources to really support them in their recovery.
Thank you, Bernhard. And again, Camilla has posted the link in the Zoom chat room. We'll make sure to get that in the Facebook as well. It might already be there, but for those who are interested in hearing a lot more on that subject, that's a great resource. But to look at the full-length program on that very topic. So we're coming to the last few minutes. So before we get final thoughts for everybody, I did want to just welcome Altina Lehman to jump on here really quickly. And she was going to share a few points about some of the resources that are available through Fellowship Hall. And then I will, Mike, when she's done, if you could just jump in and share sort of what resources are available through your private practice as well. So go ahead, Altina.
Great. Well, first, just want to thank you all for joining us today, and really appreciate our Fellowship Hall counselors and Mike spending a little bit of their afternoon to offer some insights on the issue. At Fellowship Hall, we've been in Greensboro for almost 50 years, since 1971, and we offer both residential and outpatient services. Our focus, though, is on the residential treatment, and so we have something called a primary program, which lasts about 3 to 4 weeks. Folks come and stay on our campus and go through a series of group lectures, individual counseling sessions, and just learning about the disease of addiction and how best to manage that and start their life of recovery. We are a 12-step based program, and we've been that way from the very beginning. We also have an extended program that once you finish the first initial primary program, that might be an option for some people. We have transitional housing to help folks if they finish the primary program and want to do some intensive outpatient programs and then move into that. That's an opportunity for folks to look at. I will say, you know, amidst COVID and all the things that are going on, things look a little bit different than they did 5 months ago. Checking in's a little bit different, going through admissions a little bit different. Family programs a little bit different, but we are there and we are open and we want to help. And so I would say if there's anyone out there who's interested in learning more, you can find out about us online at fellowshiphall.com, or you can call us at 336-621-3381. And there'll be folks who can answer some questions. And if we're not the right place for you, then we're committed to try to help people find the right place for them. So there you have it.
Thanks, Altina. Mike?
Yeah, right. So if you're not needing quite as intensive services as a residential program, over here at Cromroy Group at cromroygroup.com, I'm over here providing outpatient drug and alcohol treatment, therapy, and we also have staff over here who are working with couples and adolescents, and hopefully can meet you know, a wide variety of drug, alcohol, and other mental health related needs. So you can find us over at Cromroy Group. That's KRUMROY group.com.
Thank you, Mike and Altina, for that information. So before we wrap up, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to share one takeaway point that they hope that everybody will walk away from today's program. So I'm just going to go ahead and call on you all in order that you spoke today. So Mike, let's go ahead and start right back with you. What's your kind of wish for what you hope people will take away from today's program? Definitely
that there's a range of services and treatment and helping professionals out there for whether you know there's a problem and you're curious of a problem, or you're a loved one dealing with somebody who may have a problem. So there's definitely help is available, help is out there.
Always a very important point. Definitely help is available if you or someone you know might be struggling. Kendriya, how about you? What's your big takeaway point?
Well, I've absolutely enjoyed this, but my greatest takeaway is educate, 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 everybody in the house, including the dog and the fish. Educate everybody, seriously. And I think sometimes people think of it as a taboo topic, don't want to talk real openly about it. But I really think that it's going to help families so that we can start to help, and we're fighting the best we can to remove stigmas that are attached to alcoholism and addiction overall. And I just think that education really just gives us knowledge, and sometimes to move forward in a situation that might seem scary, it helps really knock down some of those myths and dispel some of those things that we are afraid to really discuss. But just get that education and educate everybody.
That is great. That's a great point, and definitely help educate others too. So if you found today's program helpful, one relatively simple thing you could do is just share it among your social media channels to help get that word out and help educate people more. Let's see. Next up is Bernhard. What's your big takeaway point for today?
Yeah, I would say just recognizing the messages that social media are giving you about alcohol use, and making a decision on what you want to do with that information. I would also say honoring internal consequences, and so you don't have to wait for rock bottom. In quotes, rock bottom. Your pain is enough. You can look at the internal consequences rather than what social media might be saying is this is when you're supposed to seek help, but instead base it on internally how you're feeling, what your relationship to alcohol is.
That is such a great point. So really kind of listen to yourself and trust your own instincts. If you have concerns, tune out the messages that you might be getting from social media that might be normalizing or telling you that you shouldn't be concerned. Definitely if you have concerns. And I do want to just recommend that anyone joining us today do check out that program. Bernhard shared a wealth of other information in that other program that Camilla shared the link with. And it's just a really great resource, especially if you have concerns about a loved one. And so finally, Nataki, what's your big takeaway from today's program? Oh, you're muted. Let's see if I can.
The main thing that I would say is to be kind to yourself, to acknowledge that this is a stressful time. This is a confusing, kind of upside down time, and that it's okay to be out of sorts. It's okay to not know what to do. But in that, to be kind to yourself, to acknowledge that that's where you're at, and to ask for help. Educating yourself definitely is important. Educating, if there's a loved one you're concerned about, or even if it is yourself. But then being open to communicate and to connect with other people. And there are so many resources out there, not being afraid to ask for help and say, I don't know what to do, to help yourself through that instead of trying to numb it away. So just being gentle with yourself.
Thanks, Nataki. Those are great thoughts. And it is true, we're in really difficult times right now, and we all need to just give ourselves and others a lot of patience, a lot of support to make it through this time, and also not to be afraid to have some of the difficult conversations if we have concerns about our own mental health, our emotional health, and the health of our relationships, and as well as others. So I just want to thank everybody, I really want to thank our participants, those of you who joined us today and shared some really great questions, very thought-provoking questions with us. And I especially want to thank all of our panelists. Thanks, Mike, Kendriya, Nataki, and Bernhard. I know I learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that others did as well. And we just thank you for giving up some of your time this afternoon to help educate people on this really important topic. So with that, we'll go ahead and sign off. If you want to catch this program later, definitely feel free to check it out on our Healthy Relationships Initiative or the Fellowship Hall Facebook page, where we'll be sharing that as well. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope that the information that we covered today will be helpful to you and your relationships and your families. So have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much.